I want to thank McGrew Real Estate so much for their amazing sponsorship of summer reading 2 years running. They sponsored us last year and then again this year, and it's so generous. And we're so very grateful to have them on board this year with summer reading. So with that, I will hand things off to McGrew Realtor Karen Davis.
Thank you. So reading is a gateway to learning and develops imagination and empathy for folks of all ages. And that's why McGrew Real Estate is so very proud to support the summer reading program. With each flip of a page, reading dares you to grow and explore new possibilities. Pick up a book and join in on the fun. And now it's my honor to welcome and introduce Lisa Cron. Our guest this evening, Lisa, works with writers, nonprofits, educators, and organizations, helping them master the unparalleled power of story to move people to action, whether that action is turning the pages of a compelling novel, trying a new product, or changing the world for the better. Lisa has worked in publishing at Norton, as an agent at the Angela Rinaldi Literary Agency, as a producer on shows for Showtime and CourtTV, and as a story consultant for Warner Brothers and the William Morris Agency. Since 2006, she's been an instructor in the UCLA Extension Writers Program, and she's on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts MFA program in visual narrative in New York City. She's the author of 3 books, Wired for Story, Story Genius, and Story or Die. Her video tutorial, Writing Fundamentals, The Craft of Story, can be found at LinkedIn Learning, which you can access with your library card. We are so very excited to host her, and believe me, you are in for a treat. Please welcome Lisa Cron.
Much for inviting me here, because there is nothing that I love more than being in a room full of writers, whether that's these days a Zoom room or, back in the old days when we actually got together in the same room. Hopefully soon we'll go back to that. But regardless, whatever the room, there's nothing that I love more than being in a room full of storytellers, because we are all storytellers, and storytellers are the most powerful people on the planet. Why? Because story is the most powerful communication tool in the universe. We think in story. We make sense of everything through story. Story is literally built into the architecture of our brains. All stories are a call to action. And to be very clear, when I say story, I don't just mean it sort of in the narrow band that we tend to think of story, these days, which was when we think of a story, we think of, a novel or a movie or a series we're watching, or, telling stories around the campfire, or, that wonderful moment before our kids go to sleep and we're reading them bedtime stories. I mean, those are stories, yes, but when I talk about story, I mean story writ large, story as has been wired into our brains for about the past 100,000 years. And when you think about it, when you think back 100,000 years, not of course that any of us can think back that far, although this past year sort of feels like it was 100,000 years. But when you think back then, there weren't novels, there wasn't television, there weren't movies, there wasn't written language, there probably wasn't even spoken language. And yet that's when story was wired into our brains. And the good news is that story is story. What pulls us into a story, what rivets us in a story, what we come to story for is exactly the same. Story is story, regardless the format, regardless the genre, regardless the use. And that's what gives you that incredible power, whether you're trying to bring in an audience, you are writing a novel or a memoir or a TV show, or whether you're a CEO writing a mission statement, or whether you're trying to get your boss to give you a raise, or you're really trying hard, please, to get your team not to text and drive. Story makes you so powerful, because with story, you have the power to change how your audience sees the world, how they see themselves, what they go out and do in the world, simply by giving them a glimpse of life, letting them experience life through your protagonist's subjective reality as she struggles with that tough story problem that you're going to toss at her. That story problem, is a problem that the protagonist can't avoid, that in order to solve that problem, she's going to have to change internally, because that's what stories are actually about, as we'll see. Stories aren't about the external change that happens. Stories are about how that unavoidable problem forces the protagonist to reconsider something that they already believe, something that's holding them back from solving the problem. And by going through it, they realize that that belief was wrong. Their belief system shifts. That allows them to solve the problem and thus change, which is why all stories are actually a call to action. And that is the power you have. In fact, my guess is it's probably more power than you realize you have at this moment. But you knew there was going to be a but, right? There's always a but. There is always a catch. And the catch is you have to have actually told a story. And that's my topic. My topic is always story. It's never writing. It's never plot. It's always story. And you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute. Didn't you just say, like literally less than a minute ago, that we're wired for story? That story is like built into the architecture of our brains. So, I mean, don't we already know how to do that? Don't we, understand story the same way we understand, breathing? And it's a conundrum. It really is a conundrum. I think it's what caused the great Southern writer Flannery O'Connor to once quip. She said this in an interview. She said, I find that most people know what a story is until they sit down to write one. And I can't tell you how true I have found that. I have worked with story and writers for more decades, frankly, than I want to admit to being alive. And in that time, I can't tell you how many stories, how many manuscripts I've read, where if you asked me, what's it about? I'd say, it's about 300 pages. I have no idea. It's just a bunch of things that happen. And so here's the fine print. Yes, we are wired for story. We think in story. We make sense of everything in our life through our own subjective internal narrative. And yes, we are instantly, from the time we're tiny on up, we are instantly able to be engaged in a story. Nobody ever, your parents never had to sit you down and say, my child, let me explain to you all the things that a story needs to do before you can give yourself over to it. It doesn't work that way. We are instantly wired for story. We hear a story and we are instantly pulled in. However, the ability to create the kind of story that has the power to rivet, whether it's a reader, whether it's a mission statement, whether it's trying to get your teen not to text and drive, that is a learned skill. And in order to really learn that skill, and perhaps even to dig down and see that it's a skill you've already got, it really helps to understand, okay, when we say we're wired for story, why? What does that even mean? So what we're going to talk about tonight are three things. We're going to talk about how story and the brain evolved in tandem. Then we're going to talk about why we use story and not facts to make sense of everything. And then we're going to talk about what it is, what biological system it is that gives story its unparalleled power. And as we do that, we're going to really bust a lot of myths. We're going to bust a lot of things that you probably didn't even know were myths. So it's going to be a lot of sort of upset, exciting upset, I think. But as we begin, I think there's one thing that we all agree on. And these days there's so little that we all agree on, but I think there's one thing that we all agree on, and that is that we all love stories. We love being lost in a story. In fact, there's never been a society on earth that didn't have storytelling. Story is a human universal, which probably should have alerted us to the fact that there's more to it than just, a great way to spend a Saturday night. So the question is, why don't we know about story's power? Why don't we know that story is our superpower? And ironically, I think the answer is because we love story so much, because it feels so good to get lost in a story. We tend to think of story as entertainment. And you know how it is. You come home from a hard day doing real things in the real world that have real consequences, where these days we haven't really been going out. So we come home from, our office in the closet. That said, we're still doing real things that have, real consequences in the real world. And, what do we want to do? We want to pick up a novel, start reading, or, turn the TV, binge watch some series or watch a movie, because we want to leave the real world behind and lose ourselves in a world of make-believe. We want to reward ourselves for a job well done. And again, the irony is, because we love a story so much, because it feels so good to get lost in a story, we tend to have marginalized it as entertainment and therefore optional. So it's very easy to think, sure, life would be far drabber without stories, but it's not like it would matter, because it's not like story serves any real purpose or anything, other than what, mind candy. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Story is how we got here. Story, as it turns out, was more crucial to our evolution than our much touted and admittedly beloved opposable thumbs. Because all opposable thumbs do is let us hang on. It's story that tells us what to hang on to. Just think of story as the world's first virtual reality, minus that geeky visor. Because without story, all we'd have is now. And I don't care what Eckhart Tolle says, being in the now all the time is not a good idea. Because if we were always in the now, we wouldn't even know there was a tomorrow, let alone be able to speculate on the dangers or delights that might be waiting for us here. Story is what allowed us to step out of the present so we could experience what has not yet happened, so we'd see what might actually happen to us should we have to face the thing that has scared us more than anything from time immemorial, and that is the unknown and the unexpected. Because ask yourself, how often does what you expect to have happen actually happen? Like, hello, 2020. And how often, when it does happen, does it feel exactly like what you thought it would? Hardly ever. Stories are simulations that allow us to viscerally experience, from the safety of our own armchair, the dangers and delights out there. So we'll see, well, what would that really feel like? And what would I really need to know in order to survive? Like, I see those red berries over there and they look delicious and I'm starving. And did I mention it's the Stone Age? So I can't, go down to the 7-Eleven, buy a frozen burrito, take it home and nuke it. But I heard this story about the Neanderthal next door who chowed down on a couple of buckets of those berries. And the way they said she was foaming at the mouth and writhing on the ground before she died. I mean, she died. That should have been enough. But it also sounded really painful. So I guess I'll forego the berries and, eat a couple of cold, stale beetles and live to see the dawn. In other words, story was so crucial. It was so seminal to our survival that nature, our biology, saw to it that it felt good. So we pay attention to it and not eat the red berries. In other words, story feels good for the same reason food tastes good and sex feels good. Because without them, we couldn't survive. And that great feeling that you get when you're lost in a story, it's not arbitrary, it's not ephemeral, it's not pleasure for pleasure's sake. You know what? It isn't even actually the point. It's actually the biological hook that paralyzes us so we can leave the real world behind. And believe me, when we get lost in a story, that is what's happening. Our biology is but a timeout on being in the moment. And we can lose ourselves in the world of the story. Do you know what that great feeling actually comes from? It's actually a surge of the neurotransmitter dopamine that is instantly generated by the intense curiosity that an effective story instantly generates. It's your brain's way of rewarding you for following that curiosity and finding out how the story ends, because you just might learn something that you need to know. Because we come to every story hardwired to ask one question: in our cognitive unconscious. Now, time out for 1 second, a little brain science here. Cognitive unconscious, what is that? Well, as you know, and as we'll be discussing, we have very big brains, but most of the decisions that we make every day are made in what's known as our cognitive unconscious, which that's sort of the scary thing about reading the neuroscience. You kind of realize, the notion of free will, maybe not. Most of the decisions we make every day are made in our cognitive unconscious. And that's actually a pretty good thing, because they say that we make, are you ready for this? 35,000 decisions a day. And of those 35,000 decisions, we're consciously aware of about 70 of them. And I am firmly convinced that the bulk of those 70 decisions are on the level of like, should I wear the yellow socks or the blue socks? In other words, things that don't really matter, which leaves the thinking part of our brain there for things that we literally don't know the answer to. And so we have to think about it. But to give you an example of the way your cognitive unconscious works, it's sort of like, and why it does what it does, as opposed to your thinking brain. So imagine that you're driving and you're in traffic. And I don't know if traffic has come back there yet here in Los Angeles, which is where I am. Traffic has started again. So I always think of this, and I'm driving down one of our freeways, the 405. And so imagine that you're driving, and ahead of you, you see a sea of red. Now, if your thinking brain had to figure out what was going on, it would look and it would go, red taillights. If I look into my memory banks, as I recall, that means that those cars are slowing down. No. Upon further empirical observation, they're actually at a dead standstill. And I'm going pretty. And by that time, let's face it, you'd be impaled in the back seat of the car in front of you. But that is not what happens. Watch. Next time when you're driving and you find your foot reaching for the brake before your conscious brain is really like caught up to what's going on, that is your cognitive unconscious. Think about it this way, the 35,000 decisions, the best other example I can give is like, think about typing. Imagine if when you were typing, you had to first think about, as you're typing, how to spell each word, and then where each letter was on the keyboard, and which finger had to hit which letter. I mean, I'm getting a headache just thinking about it. That's your cognitive unconscious. And we come to every story asking that one question in our cognitive unconscious, which is, what am I going to learn here that's going to help me make it through the night? What am I going to learn here that's going to help me better survive in the physical world? But much more importantly, for the past 100,000 years ago or so, what am I going to learn that's going to help me survive in the social world? And when I say social world, I don't mean the world of dating. I mean the world of other people. Because let's stick with the brain science for a minute and why that's so important and what stories are actually about. Because going back to that 100,000 years ago, as you probably know, and what they'll tell us, and this is true, that our brain had its last big growth spurt somewhere around 100,000 years ago. And what was long thought, what I was taught, and what you might have been taught as well, is that the reason for that growth spurt is because that's when we got the ability to think, analytically. Analytic thought came in at about that time. And that's true, that did happen. But what evolutionary biologists and neuroscientists now know is that wasn't the reason for that big growth spurt. It was at that time that the need to belong to a group was hardwired into our brains. And the reason for that was because at that time, we had, in a very rudimentary sense, very rudimentary compared to now, we could, pretty much survive on the physical plane. At that time, we were in the middle of the food chain. So that, we knew kind of not to eat the red berries. And if you were walking and you saw a cliff, you knew to stop and not keep walking. Wile E. Coyote never learns that lesson. And if a lion is coming at you, you knew to duck or run lest you become lunch. And at that point, nature, our biology realized that if we were going to do the thing that we've, for better or worse, since done, which is take over the world, we needed to learn to do the thing that they've been telling us to do since kindergarten. And that is, we needed to learn to work well with others. And that explains why the need to belong to a group so that we could work together was hardwired into our brains. And here's the thing. We are all people who need people. When people go, I don't need anybody. My success, everything I do, I'm a lone wolf. I've done it all myself. always want to turn and go, okay, you do know that wolves travel in packs. And when you look at the wolf pack, the actual definition of a lone wolf, do you know what it is? Kind of fun fact here. The actual definition of a lone wolf is a wolf that has done something so egregious to the pack that it's been ostracized and left to die. That's a lone wolf. But at the end of the day, again, we are all people who need people. And when it comes to story, story is about how to navigate the social world. And the takeaway is we don't turn to story to escape reality. We turn to story to navigate reality, because story takes big facts, dry ideas, abstract concepts, and translates them into something very, very, very specific. So we can try them on boots on the ground to see what they might mean to us. And that is why we use story and not facts to make sense of everything. And I know what you might be thinking now. You might be thinking, okay, wait a minute. I totally get what you're saying. You know, the story brings the facts to life, but when we want to make a decision, when we want to like learn about the world, don't use facts to make decisions. What do you mean? It comes from story. We don't use facts. These days, I have to say that saying we don't use facts to make decisions seems much more believable than it was several years ago. So why is that? Why is that? Because often, you know, if you give someone a fact, trying to change how they see something, they tend to get angry, right? They tend to get angry. So the question is why? So two things happen when we give people facts. Now, the first thing, this is a fact, when we get a fact that we can't unpack, a fact that we have no context, no framework to have it make sense, we can't see how this fact would ever affect us boots on the ground in our lives at all. And when that happens, that fact just flies right over our heads. The problem that we have when we're giving facts is that we tend to tacitly assume that everybody can unpack the fact the same way that we can. We also tend to believe that when they unpack that fact, they're going to feel the same way about it that we do. And therefore, all we've got to do is give them the fact, and they're going to know exactly what we want them to do. And we all know how well that works. It doesn't work. In fact, at most, when you're giving someone a fact like that, they're thinking, I know that they're trying to tell me something really important. I just have no idea what it is. It's sort of like, think back to high school, you know, when they were telling you that you had to memorize the periodic table or you needed to like learn to multiply by fractions. And you're thinking, I'm not going to go on Jeopardy. Why do I ever need to know this in my life? And here's the thing. Again, this is biology. Even if you try to pay attention, if you don't have that framework to make sense of what that fact is, you can think you're paying attention and you can put effort into paying attention. And then you notice what you're really thinking is, I'm hungry. I wonder how much longer till lunch. The other thing that happens when we get facts, and now these are facts that are meant to enlarge our worldview or meant to challenge something that we already believe. And when that happens, when somebody gives you a fact that challenges a core belief that you've got, or you give someone a fact that challenges a core belief they've got, have you noticed that it tends to make them really mad? And it's easy to think when that happens, God, what's wrong with them? What's wrong with them? They're so weak. They're so emotional. They're so self-centered. But here's the thing. They didn't decide to get angry. That wasn't a decision. The brain took the decision away from them. Because when we believe something and somebody comes and says the opposite, our brain processes that as if it was a literal full frontal physical attack. Here's another fun fact. When that happens, blood rushes to your thighs in case you need to make a quick getaway. And here's why. The reason is when you believe something really deeply, it isn't just an abstract fact out there. It becomes part of your identity. And just as important, it becomes part of what hews you to your group or your tribe. So when somebody wants you to question that fact, they want you to question literally who you are and your allegiance to your tribe. And we still have that feeling that if we get ostracized, we could be left, to perish. So it's terrifying. So we tend to want to stay with what we already know. It's known as, the technical term for it is social homeostasis. In other words, once we believe something, we want to stand pat with that belief. It's what's known as our comfort zone. And I think comfort zone is such a misnomer because it makes it sound like it's comfortable. And often one's comfort zone is anything but comfortable. Often it feels like a straitjacket. But what it means is, and what social homeostasis means, is that once we're in a situation, even if we don't like it, but we know how to survive in it, we know what to do, we know how to stay alive, we tend to want to stay in that situation because so far, so good. I mean, that's why people, you always hear them complaining about, oh, I'm so unhappy at home, or I so don't like my job, but they don't leave. You might be in that situation. I've been in that situation. And the reason is because in order to leave, we have to step into that place that is the most frightening place, which is the unknown and the unexpected. I think it's why we stick with the devil we know. There might be a really cute devil out there, but to step out might be worse than where we are. So we tend to stand pat. It's why, and I'm sure you've probably had this experience, sometime within the past year or so, because, no matter what side of the divide you're on, we seem to be very divided at the moment. And, there might've been a time where, you're talking to your Uncle Ernie, and Uncle Ernie believes the opposite of what you believe. And when he's telling you, about what he believes, are you listening and taking it in and, thinking about maybe he's right and the research you're going to do? And you're, of course not. You're not doing that. You're nodding and smiling and waiting for him to stop talking so that you can tell him why everything he just said was wrong, and, why what you believe is right. But here's the thing. When you do that, he's doing the same thing to you. Story, on the other hand, anesthetizes that part of the brain. Story is not a full frontal attack. Story brings up that dopamine, that good feeling. Watch when you say to someone, hey, you want to hear a story? You want to hear what happened? Kids, you want to hear at bedtime? People lean in. You get their shoulders relax. You can see, because what's happening is the dopamine is already starting to flow, and it's going, shh, don't talk. I want to get lost in the world of the story. And when I say get lost in the world of the story, I'm not talking metaphorically. I mean that literally. They've done functional MRI studies that show when you're lost in a story, same areas of your brain light up that would light up if you were doing what that main character is doing, or if you're telling someone a story about yourself, they're experiencing what you experienced. Story actually enlarges our ability to empathize, because, you very well might look at some other group of people and think, oh my gosh, what's wrong with them? Can't believe they're doing what they're doing. Why would they do that? If it was me, I would do it, so differently, obviously much better. And then you read a story about those people, and now you're inside their world, you're inside their brain, and you're feeling everything that is affecting them and causing them to make those decisions. And you think, oh, wait a minute, we're more alike than I thought. And your behavior changes. Let me give you a quick example. There was a study that was done in 2010 at Ohio State University, and it was in part to see what would have a greater effect on college-age women's use of birth control. Would it be a news-style documentary about the horrors of teen pregnancy? Or would it be an episode of a very popular nighttime teen soap opera? So one group of women watched this documentary that they produced, and it was really good. It had very high production values. It had lots of really scary facts, really scary figures. It had all of the things that would happen to you, from when you got pregnant until you died, and you died sooner. The other group watched an episode of the popular at the time nighttime teen soap opera, The OC, which you might remember. And in this particular episode, two of the regulars, high school seniors, Ryan and Teresa, were experiencing the gut-wrenching, heartbreaking consequences of an unintended pregnancy. No facts, no figures, no data, nothing beyond that moment when Teresa finds out she's pregnant and the world turns upside down. Now, I know you know where this is going. The women who watched the news-style documentary, up came that arguing part, because when you see a documentary that wants to change your behavior, it's implying that you're doing something wrong at the moment. It's implying that you're making a mistake, and that never goes over well. So up came that analytic part, and they thought, yeah, that's what those idiots are doing. Not me. I'm totally fine. In other words, they probably doubled down on what they were already doing. Point is, their behavior did not change. The women who watched the episode of The OC, because viscerally in the virtual world, they had experienced what Teresa went through. The last thing they wanted to do was experience that out here in the real world. And their behavior changed. Now, think about that for a minute. What was the purpose of that documentary? It had one purpose and one purpose only. And that was to change behavior. And it didn't. If anything, it probably got them to double down on what they were already doing. What was the goal of the episode of the OC? It just wanted to entertain. That was the goal. It wanted to be entertaining. And people often, we dismiss story, especially in this particular realm, as mindless entertainment. It's just mindless entertainment. It's okay. Here's the thing. There's no such thing as mindless entertainment. Stories affect us every minute of every day, whether we're aware of it or not. And mostly we are not. I like to redefine things. So here's how I redefine mindless entertainment, if you want to keep that term. Entertainment, stories come in through our gut. They make us feel something. Then they change how we see the world out there. And then our behavior changes. Remember, all stories are a call to action, but it never goes through that thinking part of our brain. So if you want to think of mindless entertainment that way, I say, have at it. And when we talked about it comes in through our gut, that brings us to our third point, which is what is it that gives story its unparalleled power? And that is what stories do. Again, they take big ideas, dry facts, abstract concepts. They make them very, very, very specific, making them acceptable to the one biological system by which we make every decision we ever make. And that is our emotion, which I know totally flies in the face of what we've been taught. It certainly flew in the face of what I was taught. Here's what I was taught. I was taught that when you want to make a decision, a big decision, but really, look for any decision, what you were supposed to do is you marshal all the facts, all the figures, all the data, so you could analyze it dispassionately in the cold light of objective reason. And while you were doing that, there was always one warning, one caveat, right? Remember this? They would always say, when you're trying to make a decision, you want to be sure that you always keep emotion at bay, because emotion is an irascible scamp and it's going to tiptoe in and cloud your judgment. And you really are going to buy that pony, which might not be such a bad idea anyway. Ponies are great. And that's a great model. It really is. It makes us feel so safe. It makes us feel so secure. How many times have you been told that it's your ability to think rationally that makes you the master of your own ship? It's a great model. It just turns out not to be true. We don't make decisions based on our rational analysis of the situation. We make decisions based on how that rational analysis makes us feel. It always comes back to how we feel. Now, a couple of my own caveats. When I say emotion, I do not mean emotional. Emotional is a very pejorative term, and all it really is a very narrow band or pitch of emotion that is so over the top that you definitely might get carried away and make a decision that you regret in the morning. We've all done that. Not that we'll admit it when we do, but I think we've all done that at one time or another. So I'm not talking about emotional, nor am I simply talking about what I like to call big box emotions: love, hate, anger, jealousy, emotions that we can name and that we've defined and that we sort of swept into little saccharine cubicles and we can keep them safely there. I mean emotion itself. Emotion itself is far more nuanced. It's far more layered. I don't think that it's ineffable. I think it's really probably quite effable. Isn't what it sounds like, obviously. The problem is we just don't have the language for it. But here's the thing, as neuroscientist Antonio Damasio says, he says, there is nothing that ever happens to us that we experience or think about or read about that does not bring with it a chorus of emotion, a surge, a chemical reaction that our brilliant brain and nervous system then translates into feeling that lets us know how we feel about it, what the thing is, what that thing actually means to us, why it matters. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that then what we feel, we're inherently just going to go do that as well, because of course we're going to think about it. It's a balance. It's not either or. It's both and. For instance, I might feel like eating an entire chocolate cake at midnight. Am I going to do that? Hope not. So I'm going to think about it. And I'm going to think, I've really wanted to eat more healthy lately. And no matter how many websites I go to, or like subreddit lines I go to the very end of all those threads, I've yet to find anyone who says that, the gateway to good health begins with eating an entire chocolate cake at midnight. And besides, I baked that cake for my daughter's birthday tomorrow. And if she wakes up and there's an empty kind of crummy plate in the sink, it's not going to go over well. So I guess I won't eat the cake. Why? Because if I ate it, it would make me feel bad. It all comes back to how you feel. In fact, if you couldn't feel emotion, you couldn't make a single rational decision. Let me give you a very quick example. Again, going back to that same neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, he's written several books, and he frequently writes about a patient he had, a man by the name of Elliot. And Elliot was a really successful guy. He had a great job. He had a great family. Unfortunately, he also had a brain tumor. Now, it was benign, and surgeons were able to get all of it out. But to do that, they had to take some of his prefrontal cortex. And, when he recovered, his body was hale and hearty. But he wasn't himself anymore. He had lost his job and his family and all his money to con men, and he was living with his parents, and the government was about to cut off his disability checks because they thought, like, hey, you were just this productive guy out there. Now, what are you, a malingerer? Like, what's going on here? So his parents called in Damasio and said, what did happen? What's going on here with Elliot? And Damasio ran a long, large battery of tests. And what he discovered was that Elliot had lost the ability to feel and process emotion. Now, keep in mind, he's still tested in the 97th percentile in intelligence, and he could enumerate every possible solution to any problem you could pitch at him. He just couldn't pick one. He'd go into his office in the morning and go, should I do that thing my boss seems to really want me to do? Or should I re-alphabetize my file folders again today? And if I do that file folder thing, would it be better to use the blue pen or the black pen? At lunch, he'd go from restaurant to restaurant looking at menus, but he never went in because he didn't know what he felt like eating. I mean, can you just imagine that alone? Can you imagine if you never felt anything about anything? I mean, think for a minute, if your beloved, suddenly had to take a job and they were away for 6 months, and now the 6 months has finally passed and they've come back and the door opens and they walk in and you feel nothing. How would you even know they were your beloved? From data, from spreadsheets, from some PowerPoint deck you were going to watch? Of course not. It all comes back to how you feel. I think it's really interesting. I used to say in this country, I think it's actually just pan-human. It's really interesting that our penultimate fear is emotion, because the goal of emotion is to upset the thing that we most want to feel, which is completely in control. Emotion is there. It is a survival mechanism to pull us and go, hey, you need to pay attention to this right now. And that really scares us. We are afraid of emotion. But the thing we're most afraid of, our ultimate fear, is being emotionless. Think about it. I mean, maybe you've seen a scene like this in a movie or read it in a novel. Hopefully this has never actually happened to you. But, like the protagonist is walking down the deserted, dark alleyway, and there's someone coming toward her, and he's got an expressionless face and dead eyes. It's like, how terrifying is that? Because as Harvard psychology professor Daniel Gilbert says in his brilliant book, Stumbling on Happiness, indeed, feelings don't just matter. Feelings are what mattering means. And the takeaway is emotion isn't the monkey wrench in the system. Emotion is the system. In life, if we can't feel and process emotion, we can't make a single rational decision. In a story, if we're not feeling what the protagonist is feeling in the moment on the page as they struggle with what to do, we are not paying attention. Because here's the thing, all story is emotion-based. That is why they say, studies show, that a fact learned in a story is 22 times more memorable than the fact just given. And the reason is because the emotion is what gives that fact an evergreen backstage pass into your long-term memory. Why is that true? Why do we need emotion to pull a fact in and make us actually remember something? Here's a really interesting tidbit. It came from a book by a neuroscientist named Dean Buonamano. I hope I've pronounced that right. The book is called Your Brain is a Time Machine. And it turns out, here's what he says, and you can read this in all of the neuroscientific literature, that the reason we have memory for one reason, and memory's goal is simple. Our memory is there to record past events in order to predict the future. It turns out our brain is not like a video camera, which is, easy to think that, if something happens and we see it, we're going to remember it. I mean, if our brain was like a video camera, and if we did record everything that happens, you'd never have to go tearing through your house, pulling everything apart, trying to find out where the heck you left your glasses or your keys. And hopefully that's not just me. The point is, what makes something memorable is that it makes you feel something. That's what makes an event memorable. If you feel something, and when you feel something, that wakes up your brain, your amygdala and your limbic system come online. And what that feeling, what the emotion telegraphs is, I need to remember this because it might come in handy in the future. That's what stories are. They're virtual reality. So we can experience something that gives us inside info that's going to help us navigate the future so that we can survive when we get there. In other words, story is a survival mechanism. It is how we got here, and it's why we're wired for story. If I leave you with nothing else, let it be this. Stories are not what we tend to think they are. And what pulls us into a story is not what we tend to think has pulled us in or what we've been taught pulls us in. What has actually pulled us in to any story is not the beautiful writing, the wordsmithing, the prose, the beautiful imagery if it's a movie, nor is what pulls us in the plot, the big external, exciting, objectively exciting, which is actually an oxymoron, things that are happening. Because story is not about what happens on the surface. Story is about why. That is, story is about what's going on beneath the surface. It's not about what someone is doing. It's about why they're doing it. As that newsreel producer said at the beginning of what used to be seen as the best movie of all time, Citizen Kane. Now, apparently it's Paddington 2. Go figure. Anyway, what he said was, there is nothing more interesting than finding out what makes people tick. That is, why they do what they do. Not in an interesting, in general way, like, oh, isn't that interesting? But interesting in the, now that I know what makes you tick, now that I know how you see things and the meaning you're reading into it, I know how to communicate with you. Now I know how to communicate and create a story that might get you to see things differently. That's the power of story. And it is irresistible. This is the point. It is irresistible. I mean, you've probably heard, a lot of us have heard, and I think it was Coleridge who said that to get lost in a story demands a willing suspension of disbelief. Could not be less true. Because when a story grabs us, when that chemical cocktail surges through our veins, and just to be clear what that is, it's not just the dopamine. What grabs us in a story in the very beginning, first, it's dopamine, curiosity. The next bit of that chemical cocktail is the neurotransmitter cortisol, the stress hormone. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen? There's something at stake here. And the last one is oxytocin, the empathy hormone. Oh, there's somebody I care about. I want to go through and find out what happens to them. When that cocktail starts surging through our veins, we are toast. We are helpless against it. We are there. When that hits our brain, we don't have the power we don't have power to resist it. Instead, what happens is we go literally offline. We leave reality and we tumble into the world of the story. And when I say we tumble into the world of the story, I don't just mean that we've tumbled into the things that are happening there. What I mean is we have tumbled into the mind of the protagonist. And as the protagonist's mind shifts, remember we said that at the very beginning, stories about how somebody deals with an unavoidable problem, and in order to solve it, something in their belief system has to shift, something that's been holding them back, something that isn't true, and now a new belief comes in, and that belief is what allows them to solve the problem. So in a story, because it is like a Vulcan mind meld, we really are, same areas of our brain light up that would light up if we were doing and thinking and experiencing what the protagonist is. And so as their beliefs shift, so do ours, without it ever going through our thinking brain, without us ever having to think about it. That is a tremendous amount of power. And that is the power that you have. Use it wisely. And that's the end.
All right. Thank you so much. We've got a couple of questions, and for folks attending, you can either use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, or you can just type it into the chat, whichever is easier for you. So we do have a couple of really great questions to start out with. Let's see, with Julie asks, with regards to the fMRI studies, do visual passages in stories make the areas of the brain associated with vision fire too?
That is a really good question. And I believe that they do, because while we think in story, we see things visually. So yes. Yeah. But here's the thing, though, when you're going to put something visual in a story, a mistake that writers often make is they'll give us visual as if we're watching it on a movie screen, and it locks us out. You never want to give us a visual that doesn't also have some story meaning. It's telegraphing something more than just that's what it looked like.
And then another question from Nancy. She says, I think a black and white dichotomy between reason versus emotion, or an underlying mind versus body dichotomy, is passé. And she was just wondering, do you still kind of like think in those terms of mind versus body, or are you thinking like it's all kind of the same mix?
It is all the same mix. I mean, I even have trouble when people talk about mental illness. It's all physical. Everything is physical. Everything comes through. There's no mind-body dichotomy. Absolutely. And emotion and reason, I mean, we were taught the cornerstone of Western civilization, it's reason against emotion, and reason is this logical thing we're supposed to go for. And emotion is this sort of like free floating nebulous cloud that has no meaning other than to subvert logic. And it could not be less true. The opposite is true. Emotion telegraphs meaning. Emotion lets us know what things mean to us. It is both and at the end of the day, emotion is the decider. And that's a biological fact. That's why they say this. They used to say the smartest among us, right? They would believe are people who know a lot of like stuff and facts. What evolutionary biologists and neuroscientists will tell us now is that the smartest among us are not people who know facts. The smartest among us are people who can read other people, are people who have emotional intelligence. That's a fact. That's hard science.
I have a question. You really focused a lot on empathy. And I think like in today's world where it just seems, we're so separated, there's, a lot of different camps, how do you make the jump from wanting to tell a story to realizing what your audience wants to hear? And does empathy play into that? Like, how do you...
Well, I think it depends on...
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it depends on if you're just going to tell them a story, like let me read you a story and it's a story like a short story or a novel, or I want to create a story that will help you perhaps see something that you're not seeing now. And the only way to do that is to really be able to step out of your own mindset and into theirs. So you're not just looking at what they believe, which will probably, make your head explode, whichever side you're on when you look at the other side, but to dive in and go, okay, why do they believe it? What does it really mean to them? What does it say to them? Is this a belief that can be changed, or is it so, seminal to their core belief system that it absolutely can't? In other words, you have to create a story that speaks to their story, meaning you don't just know what they're doing, but empathy is not just knowing what they're doing and not just knowing why they're doing it, but being able to feel that same why, to being able to go, oh yeah, I can feel why you believe that. You don't have to agree with it. But I think that that brings us back, and it ends up uniting us because we are so much more alike than we are different. It's just really being able to dive down and not getting angry. It's easy to stay like an example I have in the book is it's really easy to look at people when they get really angry. And you might have seen those signs that say like, keep your government hands off my Medicare. And you want to just give them the fact and go, okay, well, here's the thing. Medicare is a government program. So if the government takes its hands off your Medicare, you're not going to have Medicare. But that's not what they're angry about. It's sort of going down deeper and going, well, what are they really saying? And what it really is more that, well, gee, I feel like the government takes money away from me, my hard-earned money, and gives it to people who I don't think deserve it. And that's not fair. It's my money. And it has to do with a fear of big government. You can go deeper into that. And it's really getting down to where that came from, that then it would allow you to create a story that would speak to their story until they feel heard, because nobody listens until they feel heard. And heard doesn't just mean I hear what you're saying, but it means I really understand it and I understand the why, and I can play that back to you. And here, let me show you something else. And that, that would be a way to reach people. You're muted.
Okay, there we go.
It's not a mute thing.
All right. Well, are there any more questions? I think we've got about 5 more minutes. So if you want to, you can type them in the chat if you want. Use the Ask a Question button. But, all right. Oh, go ahead. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for launching our summer reading program. Huge thanks to McGrew Real Estate for sponsoring us again this summer. Very generous, and just very thankful for their support. Oh, great. And some folks in the chat that have used Story Genius. Huge thanks to you, Lisa.
Wow.
And this will be posted up on our YouTube page. I'll throw my email up in the chat. If you want a direct link to that, you can just email me and I will send it to you. So if you send it to that ksoper@lplks.org, I'll send you the YouTube link and I'll get that up tomorrow afternoon. Yeah. So thank you everyone for attending. Huge thanks, Lisa.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Thank you. And yeah, please buy our book. Check it out at your library. Check it out at LPL. And I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and we'll start summer reading.
Yay.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.